The moment I saw the line, "No salary increase this year," I laughed. Not the happy kind. The kind of laugh that slips out when you realize you have been talking to a brick wall for 12 years. It was dry, short, automatic, more reflex than emotion. But it was enough to make the man sitting across from me, Graham, flinch and set his coffee cup down. I am Marion Cole, 46, a data security specialist at Lakefront Federal Bank in Chicago. I have worked here for 12 years, in a room filled with monitors streaming system logs, alarms, and those red warning lines nobody ever wants to see except me. I am the one they call at midnight when the firewall panics, the one who gets an urgent email at 7 in the evening on a Friday that says, "Marion, can you take a quick look? Every security crisis runs through my hands. Every raise somehow walks right past me." In those 12 years, I asked for a raise 12 times, and 12 times I got the same message dressed in new vocabulary. This year is not the right time. The budget is tight. We need to prioritize strategic roles. Leadership is reviewing the compensation structure. They had an entire dictionary dedicated to saying one word: no. Each year, they just swapped the scent, like changing out air fresheners. That morning, Graham asked me into a small conference room with glass walls facing the river. He was already sitting there, holding a cup of coffee from the brand new machine management had just installed, one that cost about a month of my rent. His face carried that carefully rehearsed sympathy doctors use when delivering bad news, except he was not speaking to a grieving family. He was denying a raise. "Marion, I reviewed your request," he began. "I know how much you have done for this system. But this year, the budget is genuinely difficult. Leadership is tightening spending everywhere. I hope you understand. A few years ago, I might have swallowed hard, forced a smile, and told myself I would try again next time. But that morning, before walking into the room, I had seen something. I saw Graham in the pantry, hand on the shoulder of 3 young employees, congratulating them on their raises. 3 faces that had not even memorized the building's exits yet, smiling as they had rehearsed for the moment. One of them had asked me last week how to tell spam from a phishing attempt. I taught him. He thanked me. Then he ran off to tell Graham he had proposed a highly effective email filtering protocol. So when Graham said the budget was tight, I laughed. Not because I do not understand budgets. I work in finance. I know exactly what real financial strain looks like. I laughed because my brain finally caught up to what my heart had understood for years. The issue was never money. The issue was never me. The issue was that they never intended to spend money on me. My laugh made Graham freeze. His eyes blinked fast, his cheeks flushed, like someone had ripped the script straight out of his hands. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Is something funny, Marion?" I shook my head, still smiling. "No, I just realized I might be the most optimistic person on this floor. Believing the same story 12 years in a row is a skill, too. At my age, anger feels different. It is less like fire, and more like an airbag going off in slow motion. No explosion at first, but eventually you hear it. Somewhere. I did not argue. I did not complain about fairness. I just stared at the paper with its cold little sentences and thought about the 12 years I had let my self-respect hinge on someone else's approval. I walked out of the room and down the glass hallway overlooking a Chicago wrapped in December cold. Gray sky blending into gray rooftops, the dark water of the lake stretching in the distance. I had walked this hallway thousands of times, laptop in hand, head full of system issues. But today, my steps slowed. For the first time, I was not thinking about work. I was thinking about my life. I thought about my father, a former police officer who believed in duty and honor so deeply that it could seem old-fashioned. His health has declined over the past few years. His memory flickers, sometimes sharp, sometimes drifting. After doctor visits, he sits on the couch and asks me the same question again and again. "Is your job at the bank going well, sweetheart? Do they respect you there?" And every time I answered, "Yes, Dad. They trust me. I am valued." I said it so many times I almost believed it myself. I stayed at this job for 12 years, not because I loved banking. I stayed because it was stable enough for me to live, care for my father, pay rent, and survive emergency calls in the middle of the night. I chose safety, even when that safety was eroding me. And that morning, when I laughed at the tight budget, something finally clicked. I was not here because they deserved me. I was here because I had been afraid to walk out the door. I touched the cold glass. Below, people hurried across patches of ice, clutching their warm coffees. No one knew that on this floor a woman had just laughed after being denied her 12th raise. No one knew something inside her had unlatched, quietly, almost invisibly, like a bolt slipping out of a door. Before I go on, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? A sunny morning in Florida, a frozen corner of Minnesota, a quiet town in Texas. Maybe Canada. Maybe the United Kingdom. Maybe Australia. Maybe a small apartment halfway across the world. At this age, I have learned one simple truth. Being overlooked has no borders. It finds anyone who has ever worked hard while someone pretended not to see them. And wherever you are hearing this from, I am grateful you are here with me. That day, all I knew was that I had laughed. I did not know it was the opening note of a quiet revenge. Not the loud kind, no slammed doors, no angry emails, no dramatic confrontation in the middle of the office. It started with one small, almost invisible decision. From that day forward, I would never again try to convince anyone of my worth. I would let them discover it in a way they never saw coming. Nothing makes you feel more invisible than fixing a system failure at 2 in the morning, only to hear someone else take the credit the next day. I had worked at Lakefront Federal Bank for 12 years, but it wasn't until the last 6 that I finally understood what it meant to live in the shadow of my own work. 6 years where every effort I made was treated as routine, and every accomplishment was handed to someone else through a ladder I was never meant to climb. During those 6 years, I was always the first one pinged when the system twitched. I still remember one night about 3 years ago when my phone vibrated nonstop at 3 in the morning. It was the unmistakable pattern of a ransomware probe. Someone unfamiliar would have brushed it off as a routine alert, but I knew the difference between a strange noise and a door being pried open. I shot out of bed, opened my laptop on the kitchen counter, and typed each command like I was holding up the last shield before the storm hit. It took me nearly 2 hours to block the attack, lock down the access streams, patch the vulnerability, and scrub the malicious code clean. By the time I finished, dawn had started washing over Chicago in that pale winter blue. I made myself a small cup of coffee and told myself the bank had just dodged a federal penalty worth millions. But that morning, during the emergency meeting, I stood against the wall listening to our chief technology officer praise the incredible initiative of the young, dynamic team. Nolan, the new hire with less than a year under his belt, smiled as he had actually been awake at 3 in the morning. Nolan was exactly the type of employee management adored. Young, quick-talking, fluent in buzzwords. Sometimes he would explain security theories I knew he didn't fully grasp, but Graham nodded along anyway, calling it fresh energy. And me. I didn't have fresh energy. I had caffeine and the will to survive. As time went on, I realized I had crossed into full invisibility. Every system failure found me first, but every compliment found its way to someone else. For 6 years, I heard the same company mantra repeated over and over: give opportunities to the next generation. But I knew exactly what opportunities meant there. It meant people who fit the vibe, not the ones keeping the lights on through the night. The only person who truly saw what was happening was Helen. She was in her mid-50s, worked in system administration, hair graying at the edges, voice steady, eyes carrying a quiet understanding of the world. One night when I stayed late, she set a small box of pastries on my desk, sat down, and told me they're using you like a fire blanket, Marion. The house catches fire and they call you. But when the walls stay standing, they swear they built them with their own hands. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was painfully true. Helen wasn't someone who talked much, but when she spoke, she never missed. She told me, "You're good. You're just standing in the wrong room." I didn't respond, but that sentence followed me for months. A few weeks later, I came home late again. My father was sitting in his old recliner, watching his usual news channel. When I walked in, he looked at me for a long moment and asked, "Work okay, kiddo?" I answered the way I always did. "It's fine, Dad." He nodded, but this time he didn't turn back to the screen. Instead, he asked, slower, gentler, as if he had carried the question for a while, "Do you think you deserve better?" I froze in the doorway, still holding my takeout box. It wasn't a sharp question. It didn't accuse or push. It was just a simple question from a father who had seen his daughter come home exhausted for far too long. But it hit harder than any meeting, any rejection. I had spent 12 years in that bank, but those last 6 taught me the clearest truth of all. Some environments will never see you, even if you are standing in the middle of the room holding the entire system on your shoulders. And those 6 years in the dark were exactly what prepared me for the moment I laughed in that conference room on the morning everything changed. Because sometimes when invisibility lasts too long, it creates something else, a crack. And through that crack, the light finally gets in. I used to think revenge had to be loud, but silence, used at the right moment, scares people far more. After 12 years at Lakefront Federal Bank and 6 years buried in the shadow of my own work, I had learned one thing clearly. Here, if you raise your voice, they call you emotional. But if you go silent, they start to worry. Because the silence of someone who once held the entire system on her shoulders is never without reason. The night I laughed in that conference room, I did not sleep right away. I sat on the living room floor, my back against my father's old recliner, opened my laptop, and stared at the blank screen. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and for the first time in years, I was not afraid. I was simply too tired to keep living the same way, and far too clear headed to walk out without preparing. My plan stretched over 6 months. No drama, no open rebellion, no sabotage. Just preparation for the cleanest exit possible, leaving behind a space only they could measure. And I knew that if I did it right, that space would frighten them more than any goodbye ever could. The first step was documenting everything I knew, but not the kind of documentation that gets uploaded to company folders and stolen for someone else's credit. I created my own private archive, entirely personal, where I stored every process I had designed, every algorithm I had refined, every shortcut I had invented to keep the system from collapsing in the middle of the night. I did not take bank data or copy internal files. I only recorded the parts that belonged to me, the parts the law allowed me to keep. I wrote everything carefully, line by line, note by note, variable by variable, as if I were packing up a lifetime to prepare for a move. The second step was building what I later called the dependency map. Older Americans trust clear logic, and this map was the kind of clarity they respect. I opened a giant analysis board, outlining which parts of the bank's security system depended on what, who understood which errors, where the blind spots were, and exactly what would break once I was removed from the picture. When I drew that map, my chest tightened. Not because I worked too much, but because I realized the entire bank was standing on a foundation only I knew how to reinforce. Some connections on that board were both funny and sad. The vulnerability in the anti-intrusion module had been there for 4 years because nobody but me understood the old code. The tiny patch I wrote in 2 hours was listed as a system upgrade in the weekly report so Nolan could add it to his portfolio. I looked at the arrows on the board and thought they believed I was harmless. Truth is, I have just been busy preparing for freedom. The third step was shifting how I supported corporate clients. Still professional, still compliant, still fixing every issue by the book. But instead of letting them remember the department, I made sure they remembered the person who solved their problem. I answered emails faster, explained things more clearly, and offered long-term prevention strategies. Within a few weeks, I received 3 thank you letters sent directly to my personal inbox. Not thanking the bank, thanking me. The fourth step was reviving the risk assessment software I drafted 4 years earlier. Back then, I did not have the time to finish it, and leadership did not care because the idea wasn't theirs. I reopened the old code and read it like rereading an old journal. I spent 1 month debugging, adding features, making it smoother, faster, and smarter. No one at the bank knew what I was doing because I worked on it after hours, using only my personal time and knowledge. It was my product, and I knew that someday it would be the foundation of my new path. The final step was emotional distance, harder than all the others. Not because I still loved the place, but because I had spent too many years tying my worth to my work. From the day I began my plan, I practiced not reacting. Whatever Graham said, I simply smiled. When Nolan took credit for things I built, I did not correct the record. I stopped speaking up unnecessarily, stopped trying to fix things that were not mine to fix, and stopped proving anything to anyone. If I had spent years keeping everything upright, then now I let things stand on their own, or fall on their own. Some of the engineers eventually noticed the shift. They thought I had softened, that I argued less, moved more slowly, saved them less often than before. But the truth was, I was not slowing down. I was simply done rescuing things that were not worth saving. People only noticed the noise when I stopped. But when I worked, everything stayed quiet. And that quiet was something they had taken for granted for far too long. 6 months passed slowly but steadily. Nobody knew I already held every piece of my escape in place. A path I told no one about, not even Helen, not even my father. But it grew inside me every day, like light spreading through a dark room. And I knew that when the 6th month ended, I would walk away. No pleading, no negotiations, no grand speech. Just me stepping out and leaving them inside the space I had held together for far too long. What unsettled them was not my anger. It was the moment I started smiling. Not a warm smile, a thin, thread-like curve that appeared every time I caught someone trying to guess what I was thinking. I used to react, used to explain, used to push for fairness. But once I set my 6-month deadline to leave, I no longer needed any of that. And that shift alone made the office tremble lightly, like water quivering before something larger rises to the surface. Graham was the first to notice. He never said it directly, but the signs were obvious. Sensitive projects used to land on my desk. Lately, he began assigning me what he called support tasks, lighter work, less pressure. The kind of lines that sound caring but actually mean one thing: my role was shrinking. I saw it immediately. But instead of reacting or questioning why, I just nodded and smiled. That silence unsettled Graham. He was used to hearing me ask questions. When I stopped asking, he had no idea whether I was withdrawing or preparing. To test how replaceable I was, Graham pushed Nolan to take over the core of the monitoring system. Nolan had the confidence of someone who had never seen real consequences. He loved buzzwords, trends, and presentations. But code is not a slideshow. And his first test arrived sooner than I expected. One afternoon, the system flagged inconsistent alerts. Nolan insisted it was a visual glitch and disabled several rules he found too sensitive. That night, a third-party test slipped through without the correct layers blocking it. Not a real attack, just an evaluation. But the report spelled it out clearly. Lakefront's system was slow and missing critical defenses. That document went straight to the people Graham had spent years trying to impress, and they were not pleased. That evening, Helen stopped by my desk and set down a cup of tea. She looked at me for a moment before saying, "They are scared, Marion. Managers never know what to do when the strong ones go quiet. Quiet from someone capable is never normal." I laughed. I was not trying to be dramatic. I was simply done cleaning up messes for people who never valued the work. I still did my job, but I did not jump in before being asked. I did not fix what others broke before they noticed. I did not sprint toward every fire just because it was there. I spoke less, moved more deliberately, and my output doubled. Every action was precise. Every decision is intentional. And most importantly, I kept my emotions behind a wall, thick enough that nobody could read through it. That change rattled Graham. He could not call me irresponsible because I still delivered flawlessly. He could not reprimand me because I made no mistakes. So he chose another tactic: rewriting the narrative. One day, walking past a meeting room, I overheard him telling the chief technology officer that I was skilled but slow to adapt to the team's new style. I tended to hold on to old methods, making others reluctant to innovate. It sounded mild, almost gentle. But I knew exactly what he was doing, planting seeds of doubt, one quiet remark at a time. Once, then twice, then 3 times, always where he assumed I could not hear. I stood outside, silent, choosing not to step in. Later, Helen told me that Graham, trying to undermine me, was like a man smudging a mirror he was too afraid to look into. I only smiled. I had no desire to clear the misunderstanding. When you are preparing to leave a place, you do not bother cleaning the thoughts of those who will remain. But my silence made everything around me shift in odd ways. A few younger coworkers, once eager to ask me countless questions, now avoided my eyes. They had heard fragments of Graham's reshaped stories and did not know what to believe. I saw their confusion, but I did not explain. Silence carries its own weight, and I wanted them to discover for themselves who in this story truly needed to be worried. While internal tension worsened, I received an email from a major corporate client. Polite, formal, and sent directly to my personal inbox. Thank you, Marion, for your explanation this morning. Clearer than any documentation we have reviewed. We appreciate your professionalism and hope to collaborate further. I read the message and smiled. Not a bitter smile. A quiet confirmation that my 6-month plan was unfolding exactly as it should. The people who needed real solutions still found me, no matter how much noise Graham tried to stir up. Graham moved in the opposite direction. He began leaving me off important email threads, intentionally keeping information from me, waiting to see if I would stumble. But I did not stumble. I did not slip. I simply observed. He believed limiting my access would make me panic. But the truth was, I had stepped away from that cycle long before he realized it. I just watched him, calm, then returned to my work. Once, walking down the hallway, I felt his eyes on me longer than usual. His gaze no longer carried its old confidence. It held a hint of doubt. And if I read it right, a trace of fear. Not fear that I would lash out. Fear that I knew something he did not. I said nothing. I only smiled. And that smile, I knew, shook him more than any confrontation. Because when the one person who truly understands the system goes silent, it is never a good sign for those clinging to control. I simply watched them scramble, watched them feel the tilt of the ship I had spent years keeping steady. And the quieter I became, the clearer it was to me that the day I walked away would not just be a departure, it would be an earthquake. I placed my resignation letter on Graham's desk, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. Throughout the 6 months I spent preparing, I had imagined every reaction he might have: anger, bargaining, maybe even a polished speech to cover his panic. But when he saw that paper, he went quiet, as if someone had switched off his voice entirely. I did not choose this day for drama. I chose it because it was the day the bank ran pre-audit stress tests before the federal review. Every department was stretched thin. I knew exactly which corners of the system would need adjustment, and I knew they were finally about to face what they had avoided for 6 years. Nobody understood the patches I had written. When I said the simple sentence, "I am resigning effective in 2 weeks," the color shifted across Graham's face. He blinked twice, as if dragging himself back into reality. "Marion, you picked the wrong time. We need you desperately right now," I answered gently. "There has never been a right time for me here." One line. And Graham had nothing left to counter with. He stared at the letter the way a man stares at a crack forming in the wall he has leaned on for too long. An emergency meeting formed almost immediately. I did not join them, but from my desk I could hear the frantic voices through the glass. They were asking where the documentation was, how the procedures were updated, and why so many critical components had no clear access path. Every question circled the same truth they refused to say out loud. They had allowed one person to carry too much and never bothered to learn from her. 2 hours later, an external security engineer was brought in to evaluate the dependency risk. I stepped aside, letting him access the entire control board. He worked quickly, scanning each module, every interface I had rebuilt over the years. When he leaned back, taking off his glasses, I knew he had seen what I had known all along. If she leaves now, this bank will retain only about 30% of its actual operating capacity. You rely on Marion for roughly 70%. Silence filled the room. Thick, heavy silence. I felt no triumph and no sadness, just the sense that something had finally fallen into its proper place. They wanted the truth from an outsider. Now they had it. That afternoon, I began the handover. Clean, complete, precise. Every step is detailed, not a single loose end. I left no traps, no spite, no missing pieces. I left the way my father once taught me to leave. Honor is not in where you arrive, it is in how you walk away. Helen stood beside me, checking the list. Her face carried a quiet sorrow, but no surprise. You did the right thing, Marion. Sometimes you have to choose yourself. I nodded. Nothing more needed. When the room finally settled, I turned back to my desk. The old wood was worn along the edges. This was where I had taped the picture of my father and me, taken when he was still strong. He was leaning against his patrol car. I was holding my first security certification. I touched the corner of the photo. For years, whenever exhaustion pinned me down, I looked at my father's smile to remind myself to keep going. But today, for the first time, I realized I did not need to keep going here. I packed my things into a small box. The pen my father gave me. My notebook is filled with handwritten fixes. The ceramic mug Helen gifted me. Not much. Easier than I expected. Helen gave me a quick hug and stepped outside to block the curious eyes. I appreciated her for that. Some goodbyes deserve privacy from those who never understood the story. Graham appeared just as I was closing the lid. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his expression a mix of loss and confusion. Unlike that morning, he finally managed to speak. "Are you sure about this?" I turned, steady as I had been for 6 months. "Yes. This time, nothing and no one can change it." He looked as though he wanted to argue, but already knew it would be pointless. Graham had never been comfortable with losing control. Today he controlled nothing. Not me, not the system, not the future of the bank. I walked down the hallway. Each step felt like the weight of old air lifting off my shoulders. When the building doors opened, the cold Chicago wind rushed across my face. And yet, I felt warm. Maybe because for the first time I was breathing like someone free, not someone bracing for more responsibility. I paused on the sidewalk. People passed by, busy with their own lives, unaware of how significant this moment was. I looked back at the building for a second, then turned away, not to erase the years behind me, but to acknowledge that I had finally stepped beyond them. My heart felt heavy knowing I had left a part of my life behind, but light enough to know I no longer owed this place anything. I understood clearly now. The day I walked out was the day the bank began the journey I had foreseen 6 months earlier. A journey where it would finally face everything it had denied. As for me, I had stepped into a new chapter, one where every decision belonged to me, not shaped by budget season promises or half-hearted praise. When I walked away, I was not seeking revenge. I was seeking the truth. And the truth is this: sometimes leaving at the right moment is the most beautiful silent victory a person can choose. I had prepared myself for the bank to struggle after I submitted my resignation, but I did not expect the unraveling to happen so fast. Within 2 weeks, every polished layer they had painted onto the system began cracking almost at the same time. The first trouble came from Nolan. Only a few days after I resigned, he decided to optimize the alert system. I heard he disabled several rules I had set to high sensitivity, saying he wanted the dashboard to look cleaner so the auditors would find it easy to read. Graham agreed immediately, thinking a neat interface would convince the federal auditors that they had solid risk controls. But in cybersecurity, the things that look clean are often the things most dangerous. During the major pre-audit test, when every department gathered to showcase their incident response, the system suddenly showed abnormal latency. A vulnerability that had existed for years, patched only by the monitoring layers I built myself, was reactivated. Nobody understood why, but I did. Alerts had been muted, and the monitoring procedures were never properly taught. The third-party test unit sent its report right away. Within an hour, the Federal Audit Division sent an additional request, demanding proof of protective layers, response protocols, and documentation for risk control capability. These were things they had requested for years, but leadership always believed they could talk their way through. This time, talking would not save them. I knew it when I saw Helen walk to my desk, set the request down, and whisper, "Marion, no one here knows how to answer any of this." That afternoon, another emergency meeting. I was not present for most of it, but when I was called in at the end, I saw the tension on every face. Nolan stared at his laptop as if scrolling fast enough would cause answers to appear. Graham avoided eye contact. The legal team kept asking the same question: who approved the changes to the alert system? No one spoke, and that silence was louder than any accusation. I stayed fully professional, answering only what was mine to answer, adding nothing more. I knew they wanted me to explain on Nolan's behalf, but doing that now would be the same as reopening every slight they had dismissed. I simply stated the facts with no emotion attached. The second issue surfaced 2 days later. A major corporate client experienced a series of irregular login attempts. Not a real attack, but enough to worry them. They called support, only to be bounced around because the team no longer knew where to search after the system had been optimized. That evening, I received a brief email from the client's technology director. Only 8 lines, but every line said enough. We noticed the bank's response is not the same as before. Marion, are you still handling this? If not, do you provide independent consulting? I read the email 3 times. Then I replied with the tone of someone who had stepped through a door and had no intention of stepping back. I will leave my current role shortly. After that, I may consider independent consulting if needed. I sent the message and leaned back in my chair, not out of excitement, but with a strange feeling, like fastening the seatbelt on my own life for the first time instead of fastening it for someone else's. The next day, Graham did what everyone expected. He blamed me. In the meeting, he said my departure at the wrong time created a gap, that the system exposed weak points because I did not hand over sufficiently. Helen, who usually sat quietly in such meetings, placed her hand on the table and spoke clearly, each word like a marker. Graham, she handed over more clearly than anyone I have ever seen. The real problem is that you let one person carry the entire system for 6 years without building a team. Do not push responsibility onto someone leaving because you did not do your job. The room froze. Even Nolan did not lift his eyes. Helen said nothing more. One well-timed sentence was enough to turn the entire story back toward the truth. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Robert Hayes, the bank's chief executive officer. His tone was polite, deep, tired. Marion, I would like to speak directly. We are in the middle of the audit, and the system appears to rely on your knowledge more than we understood. I hope you might assist us for a few sessions as an independent consultant. I looked out the window at the cold Chicago sky, stretched clear and bright. A month earlier, I might have agreed without hesitation. But standing where I was now, I felt a quiet steadiness I had never known. I answered softly, I appreciate the offer, but I left this role in spirit long before I left it on paper. I no longer fit this work. Robert paused for a few seconds, and I sensed he understood the finality of that answer. After the call, I prepared tea for my father and sat beside him. He had no idea how violently the small world I had left behind was shaking, but looking at his calm face, I realized I was learning that calmness for myself. During those 2 weeks, updates about the bank trickled in from Helen. Auditors asked for more evidence. The system hit more minor errors. Graham held constant meetings to manage internal messaging. Nolan received quite criticism but still tried, insisting things were not serious. I read each update without the slightest pull to step back into the fire. Nobody stood behind me, expecting me to save them anymore, and I no longer felt the instinct to do so. By the end of the second week, I understood something simple that took me 6 years to see. It was not my departure that caused chaos. It was the fact that they had built everything on the shoulders of someone they refused to acknowledge. I merely stepped out of a role I was never credited for, and everything that followed was the natural consequence of their own choices. For the first time in years, I felt something bright and unexpectedly light inside me. Not because they struggled, but because I was no longer tied to fixing cracks I did not create. I simply observed, silent, and let everything fall into the place it should have fallen long ago. The day I signed my first contract, I realized I had spent far too long living in a room without light. Not real light, but the kind that makes a person feel they have a future, that they have the right to lift their head, the right to choose where they belong. For 6 years, I worked as if the whole ceiling could collapse at any moment, and I had to hold it up with whatever strength I had left. But that morning, when I put my pen to the first consulting agreement for North Shore Risk and Security, it felt as if someone had finally opened the door I had spent years pressing my shoulder against. I founded the company just 2 weeks after leaving the bank. No ribbon cutting, no champagne, no speeches. Just me, my old laptop, and a name I thought of on a windy Chicago night. North Shore Risk and Security. A little long, maybe, but it reminded me of Lake Michigan at dawn. Flat, strong, and beholden to no one's goodwill. The first client signed on during our very first meeting. They were the same company that asked whether I handled independent consulting. They wanted a full review of their intrusion detection system and an improvement plan. When they said, "We trust your thoroughness," I realized I had forgotten how light trust feels when it lands on your shoulders gently instead of weighing you down. Within 10 days, two more clients signed. A marine transport company in Texas that had worked with me through the bank, and a medical facility in Wisconsin whose technology director had met me at a conference last year. 3 contracts in 10 days. No advertising, no gimmicks. Just one simple truth. They knew I worked with clarity. And clarity, it turned out, was more valuable than any polished promise. I knew I could not do it alone forever. The first person I called was Helen. We met at our usual cafe on Clark Street. She arrived with her familiar calm, gray hair tied neatly behind her head. When I told her I wanted her as our project manager, Helen laughed. She said she thought her time had passed. I told her, "Helen, your time never passed. People just never knew how to use you." She nodded once, a small nod, but enough to show she knew I meant it. And just like that, Helen became the second member of North Shore. The third arrived in a way no one would expect. An older veteran named Raymond. I met him through a client referral. He had served in an information security unit in the military and after retiring, spent years fixing small computers in his neighborhood. When I asked why he wanted to return to cybersecurity, he answered with one sentence: "Because I want to work with someone serious." Near 60, his voice was deep, steady, and carried the quiet resolve of a man who had lived through too much to waste time proving himself. I hired him immediately. Our office was on the 3rd floor of a small building near Lake Michigan. Not fancy, not large, but filled with light. I had grown used to flickering neon, gray walls, and dim glass. So when I opened the door to our new office, the thing that caught my throat was the simplest detail. Sunlight. Direct, clean, unobstructed. Helen chose the desk by the window. Raymond picked the corner near the ventilation fan. I took the desk facing the door, the one with a straight view of the lake. One Saturday afternoon, my father came to visit. He walked slowly, his left leg still weak from the stroke, but insisted on getting inside on his own. When he saw the company name on the wall, he smiled as if he were looking at a grandchild he had been waiting years to meet. I handed him a fresh decal with our logo, telling him he could be the one to place it on the door. He peeled the backing carefully, aligned every millimeter with shaky hands and steady eyes. When he pressed it onto the glass and said, "Looks good, kiddo," I had to turn away to hide the smile and the wave of emotions I was not ready to sort out. Work unfolded in the way I once thought existed only in books. No office politics, no quiet sighs at the end of a hallway, no one rewriting someone else's words. When clients needed something, we handled it. When something did not make sense, we fixed it. When an issue surfaced, we said it plainly. Helen documented each stage with precision. Raymond double-checked every configuration silently, and I made sure everything moved at the right pace, not too fast, not too slow. Sometimes I thought about the old bank, not with regret, but with a simple understanding. I never belonged there. I stayed because I thought I had no choice. But the choice had always been waiting behind a door I was too afraid to open. And now, each morning when I walk into this small office, I feel like I am stepping into the part of my life I should have reached years ago. No one measures my worth through a manager's mood anymore. No one demands I fix what they broke. No one tells me to wait for the next budget cycle. I am finally where I am meant to be. And the morning light stretching across the wooden floor reminds me of that every day. When the chief executive officer called for the 3rd time, I knew they had reached the end. Not the end of the bank, but the end of the illusion that they could survive relying on someone they never valued. The first call, I politely declined. The second, I was busy consulting for a client and did not pick up. The third made me realize their patience had turned into desperation. That afternoon, the office at North Shore was bathed in fading light as the sun dropped behind the lake. Raymond paced between desks, checking a firewall configuration, while Helen pinned notes onto the whiteboard. When my phone buzzed, Helen raised an eyebrow, silently asking again. I nodded. I knew who it was. Robert's voice sounded nothing like before. Gone were the stiff pleasantries, gone the confident tone he played during leadership meetings. What remained was the exhaustion of a man finally forced to face the consequences he had avoided for too long. Marion, I will be direct. The bank is in crisis. I sat down, opened my laptop, but did not type. I let him continue. We were just suspended from federal auditing. They determined we cannot maintain system transparency. One of our three largest corporate clients left this morning. The technical department is fractured. The legal team has no unified answer. In short, everything is falling apart. I stayed silent. Silence always draws out more truth than questions do. Robert exhaled heavily, then shifted to negotiation mode. Marion, we want you back. Not the way it was. We will pay double your previous salary. You will hold the director title. You choose the projects. You choose the team. Work remotely if you prefer. Budget will not be an issue anymore. I let out a small laugh, not mocking, just the kind that escapes when a contradiction becomes too obvious to ignore. I said, interesting. The budget was never enough for me for 12 years. Now suddenly it grows on trees. Robert did not laugh. He knew my point needed no further explanation. 12 years of hearing, not the right time. And now, with the system on the edge of federal sanctions, magically, it becomes the right time. I stood and walked to the window overlooking Lake Michigan. The water was deep blue and perfectly still, unaware of the desperate calls between a company and its former employee. I spoke slowly. Robert, I appreciate the offer, but no one should return to a place where they spent 12 years knocking on a door that never opened. He went silent long enough that I wondered if the line had dropped. Then he said, voice low, I understand. But you should know this. Graham is under internal investigation. There is evidence that he hid system changes and tried to place the blame on you. I will not allow that. I closed my eyes for a second, not in satisfaction, not in surprise. When a person relies on authority instead of ability, this is almost always the end of their line. I simply asked, how far has the board gone? Robert replied, the board intends to suspend him. Every change he forced the technical team to make has been reversed for review. The federal auditors are requesting verification of his involvement in downgrading the alerts. To be honest, I do not see his career surviving this. I rested my hand on the window frame, watching my faint reflection on the glass. Some would expect this moment to feel like revenge, but all I felt was a quiet, steady peace. I said, Robert, I do not need to know what happens to him. I only know this. People always pay for what they try to hide. A long breath sounded through the phone. So, you will not return, I answered. No. Not because the money is insufficient, but my value is not measured by that money. I cannot return to a place that only sees my worth when collapse is at the door. My opportunity is not behind me. It is here at North Shore, with the people who trust me now. Robert tried to keep his composure. I understand. We realized this far too late. I ended the call with a line as light as the evening itself. Some lessons do not arrive on time, but they arrive when they must. I set my phone down. Helen paused her notes, looking at me with the understanding of someone who already knew what that conversation meant. From the corner, Raymond called out. I could not hear the words, but it sounded like someone begging. I laughed, softer than usual. No bitterness, no triumph, just the awareness that I had finally stepped out of the loop I once believed I could never escape. I returned to my desk and opened the plan for the coming week. 3 new clients were waiting for risk assessments. Helen needed the timeline reviewed. Raymond wanted to confirm the test results. Outside the window, the lake shimmered in the evening light. The past could knock 3 times, but I no longer owed it a single answer. North Shore was where I stood now, and for the first time in 12 years, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. I once thought revenge was the moment they fell to their knees, asking me to come back. But the truth is, real revenge is when I no longer need them at all. One day I sat alone in my office, watching the morning light stretch across the wooden floor like a thin ribbon, and realized I had stopped thinking about the old bank entirely. No bitterness, no sting, no wondering why they had never seen my worth. It all felt like an old room I had lived in for too long, long enough to forget there was sunlight outside the window. North Shore risk and security grew faster than I ever expected. A few months earlier, it was just me, Helen, and Raymond, gathered around a single table shimmering with reflections from Lake Michigan. Now we had 14 employees. Some had been underestimated at their old jobs. Some had been told they did not fit the culture. Some had been ignored because of age. Watching them work, I saw the truth clearly. The problem had never been them. The problem was simply that they had been standing in the wrong place. I did not run North Shore the way the places I used to work were run. No one stayed late unless it mattered. No pointless meetings. No taking credit for someone else's work. Helen managed projects the way someone tends a garden, knowing who thrived with guidance, who needed time, and who needed to be heard. Raymond trained the technical team with a calm I had never seen in younger leaders, steady and patient, never shouting, never judging. And I learned something. When a person is respected, they work as if the work itself deserves respect. Some evenings, when everyone had gone home, I looked at the risk dashboard the team had built from scratch. Clean, sharp, organized. No messy patches like the ones I used to fight with alone. It made me proud that they were skilled, but even prouder that none of us worked in a place where one person had to hold an entire building on their back. Now and then, news about the old bank reached me, not because I asked. Chicago is simply smaller than people think. Lakefront Federal Bank downsized twice in 6 months. Technology projects were frozen because the audit restrictions were still in place. Several major clients walked away, choosing more stable firms. Graham was suspended and later fired for a conclusion of dishonesty in managing system changes. Chief Executive Officer Robert stepped down 3 months later. I heard he moved to a nonprofit. Maybe that was where he hoped to rebuild himself. Strangely, none of it made me feel triumphant. None of it satisfied anything inside me. Everything unfolded like a natural chain reaction. When you remove a weight from a table, it falls, not because you pushed it, but because falling is what gravity demands. One morning, I arrived at the office before everyone else. Sunlight poured through the glass, bright enough that I had to squint. I set my tea on the desk, sat down, and let the silence settle. I thought about my father, about the afternoon he pressed the company decal onto the door, about all the years I longed to be recognized, without realizing what I truly needed was not someone else's acknowledgement. It was the right to choose where I placed my heart. I turned toward the window. Lake Michigan rippled gently under the sun, reminding me that everything can change if we are willing to step out of the places that made us small. And in that moment, I understood something I had never touched before. In the end, I gave them exactly what they had given me. Silence. Not loud, not violent, no retaliation. Just a silence that revealed the space they had created on their own. Freedom was not the day I walked out of that bank. Freedom was the day I looked back and no longer needed a single word of validation from it. If you are hearing this story and recognizing a piece of your own life in it, the endurance, the patience, the hope that someone would finally see you, then I want to say this. Sometimes the place you are standing is not the place you are meant to be. And sometimes stepping away is the bravest thing you will ever do for yourself. If this story reminds you of a chapter in your own life, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from. And if you want more stories about resilience, fairness, and the quiet freedom of ordinary people, subscribe to the channel. We still have many beautiful things to share.